No, I'm good. Okay. Oh, you're set. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I am much obliged to Alex, is that right? For letting me use his guitar.
Come on, Alex.
So can you hear this? Okay. I do have to apologize. I do not play your style of music. Well, that's a matter of taste, I suppose. But the first song I'm going to play here is actually an African American spiritual written by a black pastor in Cleveland, Ohio, and it's called "The Lost Sheep." So I'll do one more. This one a little older, from about the 12th century. Bernard of Clairvaux, but some of you will recognize it because it's a hymn that churches still sometimes do. Okay. Now, I probably need to get disconnected here, or do you have a case you want to put the guitar in? It's okay? All right. Can I just disconnect without messing something up? I'm good? Okay. Oh, yeah. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are going to do not the lost sheep, but the lost Job today. So let's see if I can find it here. All right. So I can't get there. There we go. Now. Okay, am I still good back there, Eric? Okay. All right, I found my place. We're going to start again with the theologian Charlie Brown. You may know, I don't know if you know, Charles Schulz was a Presbyterian. And so a number of his cartoons bring in things from the Bible, sort of from the side, and this is one of them. Charlie Brown standing on the mound, 9 home runs in a row. Good grief. What can we do? So his catcher, Schroeder, comes out and says, Charlie says to him, "We're getting slaughtered again, Schroeder. I don't know what to do. Why do we have to suffer like this?" Schroeder says, "Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward." What? What's that supposed to mean? He's quoting from the book of Job, Charlie Brown, 7th verse, 5th chapter. Actually, the problem with suffering is a very profound one. Lucy, of course, comes up and says, if a person has bad luck, it's because he's done something wrong. That's what I always say. Well, that's what Job's friends told him. But I doubt well, what about Job's wife? I don't think she gets enough credit. She's a true modern woman. You go, girl. I think a person who never suffers never matures. Suffering is actually very important. Who wants to suffer? Don't be ridiculous. But pain is a part of life, and a person who speaks only the patience of Job reveals he knows very little of the book. Now, the way I see it, Charlie Brown says, I don't have a ball team, I have a theological seminary. So, today we want to look at the book of Job, but we want to look at it in the context of what is often called the problem of evil. The problem of evil. And to set this up in the way that a modern thinker would probably do it, you need to understand that the problem of evil as it is currently expressed by most philosophical thinkers is somewhat along these lines. If God is all good, then he must not be all powerful, or else he would eliminate evil. Okay, you see the logic of that? Or the opposite, if God is all powerful, then he must not be all good, or else he would eliminate evil. And so essentially, what we call the problem of evil is a set of polarities, a set of opposite statements in which it balances God's goodness against his power, and basically says you can't have it both ways. You can't have him both all-powerful and all good at the same time, so long as evil exists. Otherwise, he would get rid of it. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with these positions, but you do need to understand how the modern thinker sets this up. And so the problem of evil is most serious for the person who believes in an all-powerful and an all-good God. For the atheist, the idea of evil is not really evil as you think of evil. It's just an abstract way of naming what you don't like. But for Christians who believe in God, evil is not only a category, not only a moral category, but it has a sort of personal quantity to it by which we use the name Satan or the devil. This is essentially the problem of evil. I want to stop right there and see if you, at least if you have the idea of the problem in your head before we go forward. You see why this logic is working in a particular direction. The primary issues about evil have to do with moral evil. Moral evil is evil by some conscious, intentional force. So if we talk about a sexual predator, for instance, we're talking about moral evil. If we're talking about Adolf Hitler exterminating 6 million Jews, we're talking about moral evil because this is intentional. This is conscious. This is not an accident in history. This is someone with a mind who designs things that in fact are morally evil. We also want to talk about natural disasters. Here in the Pacific, natural disasters come primarily in the form of what? Volcanoes and hurricanes? Something like that. But those are natural evils. They're not intentional. They're not conscious in the sense that a predator would be conscious. They are sometimes called acts of God, but that's just the way the insurance company talks about it, so they don't have to pay you anything. Anyway, then you have things like animal pain and varying kinds of animal pain. Do you think that worms have pain? You stick one on a hook and it does this, you know. Is that because it's in pain or it's just trying to get away or what? We certainly know that larger animals, mammals for instance, have significant pain. I don't know if you've ever heard a rabbit cry. I have, and it's not very fun actually. It's pretty sad. Human suffering in general. As missionaries who do outreaches in various parts of the world, and much of your outreach is in what we call the two-thirds world, you see a huge amount of human suffering in various kinds, ranging all the way from starvation to exploitation of people to all kinds of things like that. But it's not just human suffering in general. Oops. It is inequitable human suffering. So why is it that some people seem to suffer more than other people? It's not like it's spread evenly across the human race. It's in pockets. There's some places it's really bad and some places maybe not quite so bad. And so that brings us to the book of Job. And I want to frame this question sort of philosophically first before we get to the book of Job, because essentially the book of Job is a philosophical book. There are a few books in the Bible that are philosophical, and probably the two that come to mind most readily are Job and Kohelet. Kohelet that's the book you call Ecclesiastes. Those books are both philosophical, and they address major intellectual and philosophical problems. Now, I know when you read the book of Job and you start studying it, you get preoccupied with a lot of kinds of questions. Is it a real historical Job, or is this a sort of a parable and that sort of thing? And those are all interesting questions. But I think you can get bogged down with those questions and miss the real point. Whether or not the book of Job is historical in the sense of, Charlemagne, or whether it is more of a parable, in a sense, is kind of beside the point, because the basic message in the book of Job will be the same either way. And that's the most important part of this book. So we want to look at the book of Job, and we want to introduce you to a word that you probably don't use most Tuesdays or Thursdays of your life, and that's the word theodicy. Theodicy is a way of talking about the problem of evil with respect to God. And theodicy is a word that means you are finding a way to explain why God allows evil in the world. It's a defense of God in a sense, theodicy. And the book of Job is a theodicy. Interestingly enough, this book is not the only ancient text that addresses a question like this. There is an ancient cuneiform text in the British Museum that is sort of loosely called the Babylonian Job, in which there is a very similar story to the book of Job, except it's not about Yahweh and Job, it's about another ancient Near Eastern person and one of the gods of Babylon. But he's wondering the same kind of thing. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to spend my time trying to honor the gods? I seem to have a lot of trouble in life. I've got difficulty with my family, I have difficulty with my occupation, I have suffered significant loss. Why then should I even serve God? And in essence, that Babylonian kind of Job is asking the same kind of question that you find in this book called the Book of Job. So we want to take a look at this book today because it's such a profound question, and I think a pretty profound answer as well. In fact, for people who are unbelievers, this can be one of the biggest hurdles they have to cross. Why is there evil in the world? And often it is very personalized because they have had some tragedy in their own family. Their sister died, or somebody got cancer, or somebody got hit by a truck, or any number of kinds of tragedies that happen in the human family. And they find it difficult to reconcile those kinds of things with a God who is good. They want to ask the question, why did God allow that to happen? And that's a hard question. So the book of Job is going to address some of this for us. So let me stop that. Now I've kind of set this background and see if this makes sense or if you have any questions at this point before we actually start looking at the book itself. Okay? By the way, my thanks to all of you that got up at 4:15 this morning to go work in the kitchen. I was up too, up on my bed, deep in meditation. But anyway, thank you so much. I know this is a challenge for you and going to be for some time, but my hat's off to you. All right, let's talk about theodicy in Job. And first of all, it's extremely important to note the setting of this book. Job is a man of impeccable character. It begins right away in the very first verse. There was in the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God. He shunned evil. This is extraordinarily important because if you don't understand this setting, that Job is a fundamentally good person, he's a righteous person, then you don't understand the tensions that will develop later in the book. He was rich, but that's not the main point. That just happens to be the case, and in his case, he's going to lose it all. He is utterly devout. Notice, if you will, verse 5. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have his children purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. Now, this is a man who's not only serious about his own righteousness, he's serious about his children. And he wants them to be righteous. And he wants to in some way, counter any problems they might have had, or any hesitancy they might have had about God, or any inappropriate things they might have said or done. And notice how he responds to his tragedies. We all know, of course, how the scenario goes. There is the heavenly council, and the angels come and talk to God, and Satan, of course, comes along with them, and they're there. And who introduces the subject of Job and his prosperity. It's God, it's not Satan. Satan comes along and God says, hey, you seen my boy Job? Yeah, I've seen him. I think this is a put-up job. And in this, of course, God is going to allow Satan to attack Job. Now, God does not attack Job. He allows Satan to do that. But nonetheless, Job is going to have a series of tragedies in his life. And those begin in verse 13 of the first chapter. In repeated strokes of tragedy, Job loses all of his wealth, and he's eventually going to lose his children as well. And what is important in this first chapter is down in verses 20 and 22. At this, Job got up and tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground in worship. Is this the sort of thing that causes you to worship? Usually we need a lot of energetic inspiration for worship. Job worships in the midst of absolute horrific loss. Every time I read this, I think about a friend of mine who just passed away, actually, about a month or so ago. But about 12 years ago, he and his wife were in their home during the Christmas season, and his wife had a candle on a shelf in their living room that was actually lit. And they had gone to the basement for, I don't know what they were doing down there. But anyway, in Michigan we have a lot of underground rooms called basements. I don't know if that's true of most places, but it's true in the Midwest. And the screws that held the shelf on the wall gave way. So the shelf fell, the candle fell, started the carpet on fire, and within a matter of just a very short time, their entire house and everything they owned burned to the ground. They barely were able to get out alive themselves. And I can remember Bill. Bill was a Norwegian, by the way, and so he doesn't ever smile, you know. He's just real sober kind of guy. If you're Norwegian, I guess I just insulted you. I apologize. But anyway, Bill said he stood in the yard watching his house burn and quoting from the book of Job. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is the incredible response of this man in the midst of tragedy. Job fell to the ground in worship. Said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. That is the setting for this book, and that is such a critical setting. So the setting is essential because the book is not about the suffering that Job deserved. It is about a righteous man who suffered even though he was righteous. And that, of course, takes us into this problem of evil. And the question, why has this happened? Now, the question why is very much an existential question. It's a question of meaning. It's a question of being. Why is this happening to me? And so Job begins to explore the ramifications of what has happened to him. In the beginning of chapter 1, he opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. May the day of my birth perish. And the night it was said, a boy is born. That day may it turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine upon it. Job is in the depth of despair. Back in about the 12th century, there was a Christian mystic by the name of St. John of the Cross. I don't know if you've ever heard of St. John of the Cross, but he wrote a work called The Dark Night of the Soul. And in this work, he explores what it means to be a person of faith in the midst of almost complete darkness in every aspect of life. Job experiences this. He curses the day of his birth. I don't know, I mean, most of you are younger than me. Most of you are a lot younger than me. In fact, for me, most of you are children. I mean, that's a comparative statement, not a statement about your intellect or anything. It's just that when you get at my place, there's not near as much ahead of me as there is behind me. And when I think about myself at your age, at least, I don't know that I had really encountered a significant moment in life where I actually wished I had never been born. And I don't know if you have or not. Maybe you have. But I would guess that probably most of you have not actually truly felt that it would be better had you not been born. But if you have had that, and if that should ever happen to you, you'll find this is a very dark time. We talk about, you go through a dark time. That's a dark time. I have experienced that later in life where I wished I could be dead. But that has to do with pastoral ministry. So it's, So Job is in very difficult straits. In verse 11 of chapter 3, he asked why he was not stillborn. Why did I not perish at birth? Why was not I just stillborn? Wouldn't it have been better for me to have been dead when I was born? Verse 16, or why was I not hidden in the ground like a stillborn child, like an infant who never saw the light of day? Now I'm reading from the NIV, and I know you're reading from the NLT, so there's probably slight differences in language, but the essence there is still the same. And then finally in chapter 3, near the middle of the chapter, beginning of verse 13, he contemplates that death would be preferable to life. It would be better for me to just die. By this time, of course, Job has not only lost his wealth and his children, he has lost his health as well. He is in physical distress. His body is filled with some sort of horrific disease, which is usually called boils, but we're not exactly sure how to diagnose his medical case. But he hasn't got a lot of really strong support from his wife in this situation. This has been a difficult time too, and well, it's just very hard. He's got some friends, 3 of them at this point, that heard about all this problem, and they come from their homes and they meet together and they sit down to sympathize with Job, and they stare at him for 7 days. That had to be a little unnerving too. They don't say anything at first, they just sit and look at you. So here's Job. From this personal question then comes the more universal question, why is life given to those who are consigned to misery? This is right near the end of chapter 3, verse 20. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than hidden treasure, are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave? Now, I do think it's important to point out that Job is not at this point suicidal. He is talking about the preference of death, but not death by his own hand. It would just, in his viewpoint, be better if he died in some way. He doesn't exactly say how, but there's no hint that he is suicidal. But he is really in a moment of extremity here. So out of this, let me ask you this question. Why do you think that most humans think that long life and health are somehow rights rather than gifts? Probably, yeah. Just an assumption about, yeah, maybe. Any other thoughts? Sure.
They're still in the mindset that they can earn something or it's by works that achieve.
Maybe. I'm too good to die. Maybe. I don't know. When a child dies, our general response is that somehow this isn't proper. And we think of that in a different way than when our grandparents die at 94. Okay? When a child dies, it's like somehow they've been deprived of their rights. And we think of life in terms of rights rather than as a gift. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question myself either, but I do think that the biblical point of view is that life is a gift rather than a right. It's something that God gives you. So what are the implications of Job's words? He says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What are the implications of that statement by Job? Yes. God ultimately has control over both the good and the bad that happens in our lives. He's sovereign. Okay? Yeah?
Job, like, I think implication is that when Job mentions the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, he points at God for the one who took it away, but it's not actually God that took it away, it's Satan. So he's wrong, but he still blesses the Lord and he's delighted.
Okay.
Which means getting it right or wrong with the Lord is not that essential. What we have to do is run into the Lord's situation where just glorify the name of the Lord, and whether what we think is right or not doesn't really matter.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. Certainly, Job doesn't seem to have any knowledge about this little scene in heaven with Satan and God and the conversation. If he had that knowledge, he might have thought about it differently. I don't know. But he doesn't know about that. So even though he doesn't know about that, and even though he says, well, this is from the hand of the Lord for good or for bad, still, he does not charge God with wrongdoing. So I think you're right. He is operating to some degree blindly at this point, and yet in spite of his blindness, he is careful about what he accuses God of. So yes.
But the other thing was kind of just a way of saying, like, what's ours isn't really ours anyways to begin with. So how do you grieve something that, like, isn't really even ours? You know?
Okay.
Like, the Lord gave it to us, but like,
Sure.
like in the aspect of your children, like,
Sure.
they aren't ours. Like the Lord
Yeah.
gave us the gift.
Well, we sure think they are, don't we?
Yeah. So it's like you can take them from us, but
Yeah.
they weren't ours to begin with.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, I think all of those kinds of ideas are part of this scenario with Job. And then, of course, we come to the solutions of Job's friends. These are people that you would really like to have as your best friends, right? The bulk of this book, beginning in chapter 4 and all the way through chapter 37, is a detailed series of conversations between Job and his friends. And each of his friends attempt to offer some wisdom on Job's tragedy and why it's occurred. And they are quite a group. With friends like these, you really don't need any enemies. You start with Eliphaz, and his basic thing is that, Job, your suffering is punitive. You are only getting what you deserved. Suffering is a type of judgment. Now, you find any Christians say things like that? I find them by the bucket load. If something bad happens because you must have done something wrong. Well, you must have missed God's will on that one. Something like that. And so Eliphaz basically says in chapter 4 and verse 7, consider now. Let me reason with you, Job. Here, let's be logical. Who being innocent ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, wow, sounds like he's really been perceptive about human life. As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. At the breath of God they're destroyed. At the blast of his anger they perish. Well, how comforting is that? Basically, what is he saying? Job, you deserve this. Then, of course, you continue on. He's not quite through yet. Chapter 5 and verse 17. He says, Job, blessed is the man whom God corrects. So don't despise the discipline of the Lord. In other words, you should welcome the suffering as the judgment of God. And then in verse 27 at the end of chapter 5, he says, we have examined this. It's interesting that he thinks that he speaks for the whole wisdom of the human race. We have examined this, and it is true. So hear it and apply it to yourself. Application. Yeah, there you go. The wrong application, but application nonetheless. And then there's the second friend. This is Bildad, the one they call the small man in the Bible, the Shuhite. Even shorter than Nehemiah. Not quite as small as the Philippian jailer. He went to sleep on his watch. You didn't think I had worse ones than yesterday, but I do. So we get to Bildad. His contribution, take a look in chapter 6 and verse 24. Well, I'm sorry, not chapter 6 and 24. I'm looking really at chapter, where am I at? Oh, chapter 8. I'm sorry, chapter 8. Bildad says, this is after Job has defended himself. How long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind. Well, that's really comforting. Job has tried to explain, I haven't done anything. Eliphaz keeps telling me this is a judgment, but I haven't done anything. Bill says, you blustering wind. How are you going to say such things? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned, He gave them over to the penalty of their sin. In other words, your kids all died because they're bad kids. Wow, this is a hard thing from your friend, But if you look to God and plead with the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, even now, He will arouse Himself on your behalf and restore you. Your beginnings will seem humble, so prosperous will your future be. Oh, yeah, not very helpful. Then you get to Zophar, and there's several speeches by Zophar as well. One of them, chapter 11, basically says Job is just full of idle talk. And then notice what Zophar says in chapter 11 and verse 6. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. In other words, as bad as it is, Job, it's not near as bad as it ought to be because you're probably even worse than your punishment. You should be punished even more. God has even forgotten some of your sin. He's not even given you what you ought to have. And man, poor Job, he's like, gee, Merry Christmas. What can I do with these people? That's why later he starts waxing into sarcasm. Have you noticed the sarcasm in the book of Job, in Job's speeches? And some of them are dripping, surely you're the people and wisdom will die with you. He really goes off on that. Then there's this fourth character that shows up kind of a little more than halfway through the book by the name of Elihu, which basically argues that Job should not have defended his own innocence. Instead, he should have justified God, but he should not have defended himself. Now, these conversations in the book of Job are the parts of the book of Job that most Christians don't read. Most Christians read chapters 1 and 2 and kind of skip right over to the end, chapter 42, and just kind of wave at those other chapters as they go by. But really, it's the interior of the book of Job that is the main part of the book of Job, because it is these conversations with his friends that mirror the way that people popularly think about tragedy, and often the way that religious people think about tragedy. So let me ask you, how common are these kinds of answers by Job's friends? By often very well-meaning Christians. I think they're very common. I think people tend to respond very much like Job's friends responded. If something bad happens to you, it must be your fault somehow. And that isn't necessarily the case. What is missing in the answers of Job's friends? What are they missing? Well, they're certainly missing compassion. I don't see lots of compassion here. Even if they were right, they could still be compassionate. Yes? Yeah, they seem to be very limited in understanding God's character. They think of God primarily in terms of the justice mode of cause and effect. This happens, therefore God does this. Everything is cause and effect. And that is simply not true about God. Justice is not just desserts. Okay? Justice is also grace. And it is righteous with God to forgive sins, not merely to punish them. They seem to be entirely blind to that aspect of God's character. Now, of course, they live a long, long time ago, so we don't want to think that they have to know St. Paul way back in this period. But nonetheless, they still seem to be largely ignorant of a side of God's character. How about this? Did Jesus ever address questions like this? And if so, where might he have done so? Yep.
Was that man I think it was blind, and they were
Yeah.
like saying that, oh, his parents must have sinned, so he's born.
Yeah.
Jesus said, no, it's for my glory that he is this way.
Yeah. This is the story in the Gospel of John about the man born blind. If you think of bad consequences as only cause and effect, that any bad consequences is actually the effect of something you did, what do you do with a guy that's born blind? So they said, "What? How could this be?" You know, the disciples are kind of in the same line of thinking as Job's friends. And they asked, did this man sin? Well, the only way he could have sinned if he was born blind was to have sinned prenatally. Can you imagine a fetus making a moral decision toward evil? I mean, it's just ludicrous, you know? So if it wasn't him, maybe it was his parents. Maybe they did something really bad. There's a judgment on them. And basically, Jesus says, neither of those things are right. This man hasn't sinned. It's not because his parents have sinned. This tragedy has happened in order that the glory of God would be magnified. And so that gives us a clue in the teachings of Jesus about something about evil in the world, that evil is allowed to exist in the world in order to magnify God's glory when it is rectified. And I think that's an important idea. There's another time or two that Jesus addresses questions like this. In one case, he addressed the fact that there was a construction accident, a local construction accident. Some people were building a tower. The tower collapsed and killed a bunch of them. And Jesus said, do you think those people were worse sinners than other people around town? And the answer was no. This tower didn't fall on them because they were such bad people. It just fell on them. But Jesus said, if you don't repent, you'll perish too. So Jesus does talk about questions like that. And the book of Job and the teachings of Jesus have a lot of intertwining ideas. Now, Job struggles with this whole thing, not only with his friends, but with what has happened to him. And some of the things that he struggles with, I think, are important ideas. Look, if you will, at chapter 6. Job says, if only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas. Job's feeling pretty low at this point, isn't he? If I could weigh my grief, it would weigh more than all the beaches in the world. It would just be intolerable. And so he doesn't know why this has happened to him, but he is suffering. And then in chapter 9, Notice especially at the beginning of this chapter the kind of question Job asked. He says, how can a mortal be righteous before God? What he's saying here is that, okay, I don't know that I've done anything. I can't think of anything I've done to deserve this. But on the other hand, when I am placed side by side with God, who is truly holy in the absolute maximum sense of the word, how can I ever be holy side by side with God? If I wanted to argue my holiness, verse 3, though one wished to dispute with him, he couldn't answer him one time out of 1,000. I mean, there's no way I can argue with God about my holiness when God himself is the essence of holiness. And so he doesn't really know how to work through this problem. Later in chapter 9, in verse 14, he says, how then can I dispute with him? How can I argue with God? How can I find words to argue with him? Even if I were innocent, I still couldn't answer him. I could only plead with my judge for mercy because he's God and I'm a human. And I'm just not on the same level with God. Another question that Job struggled with is there anyone in the universe that can legitimately arbitrate between human creatures and Almighty God? He says this also in chapter 9. In verse 32, he says, God isn't a man like me that we can have a chat with each other, sit on the park bench and discuss this thing. He's not even like a human judge where I could confront him in court and defend myself. And he asks in verse 33, if only there were someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both. Someone who, as it were, could stand between me and God and put one arm around God and one arm around me and bring us together. Someone to lay his hand upon us both. Then I'd be able to speak up without fear of him. But as it stands, I really can't. Another thing that Job speculated about was whether or not God allowed suffering because he enjoyed it. Now that's a pretty bold question, but notice what he says in chapter 10 and verse 3. Does it please you to oppress me? You smile when I'm suffering because of all of the schemes of the wicked? Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? In chapter 14, Job longs for relationship with God, but he wonders whether God longs for relationship with him. Does God really want to have a relationship with me? So he says in verse 14 of chapter 14, if a man dies, will he live again? You call and I will answer. You will call for the creature your hands have made. Surely then you will count my steps, but not keep track of my sin. My offenses will be sealed up in a bag, and you will cover over my sin. Job seems to understand something that Job's friends did not, and that is that God seeks relationship with his creatures. And even in the midst of this suffering, it somehow sharpens this question for him, that God longs for this relationship. But then, of course, there's the question of inequitable suffering. Why is suffering unequal in the world? And he addresses that a little bit in chapter 21. So all of these things are part of Job's struggle in the world. And finally, the last one, why is God silent in the face of suffering? Why doesn't he postpone, or why doesn't he do something immediately instead of postponing justice? There are 2 or 3 really good books that if you've never read them, you probably ought to at some point in your life. One of them is by C.S. Lewis. It is called The Problem of Pain, and it addresses this issue, the problem of evil and the problem of Job. Another one is by an author by the name of Philip Yancey. Where is God When It Hurts? That's a shorter version. He has a longer version as well. But those are 2 authors that you may want to think about, C.S. Lewis and Philip Yancey, who have written on this subject extensively and with some very insightful and helpful works. So the next time you're really discouraged, pull out Why Is There Pain or the problem of pain, see if you can work through it. Now, throughout all of this struggle, Job continues to defend his innocence. He berates his friends. They're very uncompassionate. He gets really sick of his friends. He wishes they would, at one point he says, if you guys would be all together, just shut up. It would be wisdom for you. He's about had it with his friends. But in the end, Job consigns his case to God. All the way up in chapter 31. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. In other words, God, I'm going to leave it up to you, but I need to hear from you. I've heard from my friends. This has not been helpful. I need to hear from you. I'm going to consign my case to you and hear what you have to say. So let me ask you, do you think Job was right in protesting his innocence? Elihu, the fourth friend, accuses him severely on that line, that you are wrong to protest that you're innocent. What do you think? Do you think Job was right in protesting his innocence, or is Elihu right? That Job should not have protested his innocence. Oh, yeah. Almost missed you. Sorry, Ellie.
If he's protesting his innocence, isn't he making the same assumption that his friends are? Because he's saying that my innocence is connected with the pain that I'm suffering, and so I'm innocent, and so he doesn't deserve the pain. But really, like, it's not connected at all.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. So are you saying yes or no?
I'm saying he doesn't need to.
He doesn't need to. Okay. He's largely protesting his innocence in view of the accusations of his friends, because what they are saying is not really true, and he's protesting his innocence to them. Whether he's really protesting his innocence in some sort of total sense, I think that's not quite so clear. Elihu seems to think he is, but I'm not sure that's necessarily right. And in the end of the book, God is going to address the three first friends and tell them that they're wrong, and he's going to ignore altogether Elihu, which suggests that when you don't even get a response, that's the biggest insult. You're not even worth talking to. So whether Elihu is the worst of them or not, it's been argued, though, that he's the worst of the friends and that God doesn't even give him the time of day. There's another view that Elihu is a portion of the book that was inserted later in the book that wasn't originally part of the book. So that would change all the dynamics of that kind of thing. But regardless of that, Elihu does not get addressed at the end of the book. Anybody else on this idea about Job here? Yeah.
I was pretty proud of him that he was down because everyone's starting and stuff, and he's like, no, I know the truth, and the truth is I have kept God's laws, and I've been doing the right things. And like just me, I know if someone came up to me and said that, I'd be like, shoot, like I must be wrong, like everyone's telling me I'm wrong. But he was like, no, I've been doing the right thing.
Yeah, I don't know why this is happening to me, but it doesn't seem to be for the reason you guys are saying. In that sense, he is reasonably protesting his righteousness. Yeah. Do you think he ever stepped over the line? Now, you've been reading the book of Job. I think you've read it all now, right? So, and it's a long book, right? It's like the line in one of the English poets, what does it say? Follows like a tedious argument of insidious intent. If you're familiar with British poetry. But anyway, it is a long book. Where, if anywhere, do you think Job might have stepped over the line? Okay, yes, and
I don't know where, but like there's a few times it's quite like accusatory of God.
yeah,
Not like in a good way. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's like times we're talking about like how David like will question God, but then always resolves on a good note. But Job kind of like, so it's That would be like,
It's pretty blunt. It's pretty blunt, some of his questions to God. I would agree. Yeah?
I think he's just angry.
Yeah. Well, wouldn't you be?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would too.
I totally empathize, and I think
Yeah.
that sometimes when you're angry, doesn't mean that you're stepping over the line. It's you're angry,
Yeah.
and therefore things aren't
Your
so-
perspective is skewed
right,
because of
and
your
the
anger.
flavor with which you give those words isn't so sweet and subtle anymore. It's
Yeah.
like I have zero filter now
Yeah.
because I'm blind.
Because I hurt.
Yeah, it's ash heaps, and therefore, like, I'm going to be a little bit more blunt,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
I think God can handle it, too.
I think God can handle it. In fact, can you think of other people who were blunt with God like that? David? The one I think of mostly is Jeremiah. You read the prayers of Jeremiah. Jeremiah says some things to God that I think, whoa. He said, God, you're just not faithful. He said, you're just like a brook that dries up. I mean, I'd see some help here and you're just gone. It's like, whoa, Jeremiah, back off, buddy. You're talking to God here, you know. But I think someone, I don't remember which of you said that, but I think it was you, Ellie. But God can take that sort of stuff from people who really are wrestling with Him. Job is wrestling with God, but he's not wrestling against God. And there's a difference.
It's like he's trying to understand God still.
Yes, yes,
He's not full, I think he's convinced because of what's happened in the past. Like, God is here, but where is he now?
yeah,
And as a person, like, I'd rather hear somebody for where they're at, where they think, oh, I praise God in the light, when it's like that's not really what's in the heart. That's what God's
Yeah.
most concerned about.
Yeah.
He doesn't want us to be putting on the cover in order to please him.
yeah,
And so Job gives me hope
yes.
that God
He gives me hope too.
gives me hope that God takes us as we are.
Yeah,
And Job is able to say, I know this, but that's not how I'm feeling.
yeah.
And thank you, Job.
And in spite of all of this, Job deeply believes in God. This is the man who says, even if he kills me, I'm still going to trust him. He deeply believes in God, but he is in pain. He is in a world of hurt. And I think that's pretty realistic because life will bring to you those kind of moments. There is a brand of Christianity that seems to suggest that if you are a believer in the Lord, you won't ever meet any of those dark nights of the soul. And I think that's really bad theology. It is a blissful ignorance about the full message of Scripture. Christians, believers, will meet difficult times just like everybody else in life meets difficult times. And you are not exempt from that. In fact, in the New Testament, Paul will say, you should be glad that you were chosen by God to share in the suffering. This is in Philippians. You were chosen by God to share in suffering. Well, I don't know if that's a good evangelism point, but nonetheless, it's a realistic part of the Christian life. And in fact, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians, one of the primary marks of good leadership is suffering. Suffering is a characteristic of Christian leadership. And I think that ties in with the book of Job as well. Where are we at here? Somebody, right in front of me, I'm sorry.
I had one other thought. It was just striking me because I agree with that in one sense that it's good for him to be like real and raw.
Yeah.
We contrast him with Jesus.
Yeah,
Job's real and raw is before men.
yep,
And Jesus is real and raw is in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah.
Before men, he speaks like
Mhm.
maybe like 5 words.
yeah,
And I think it, again, and not like bad on Job or bad on us, but I think it really does reveal where Job's at. Like he views it almost as like me versus God.
mm-hmm.
So he still has a theology like his friends, like the times,
To some degree.
to some degree. Even though he does trust him, it's also like
He doesn't
I'm
understand.
versus you.
Yeah,
Whereas Jesus, I think, really understands that
Yeah.
he's with me. And again, he doesn't understand. He's fully human.
Yeah,
He says,
yeah.
I don't want to do this. I don't want to die. but not what I will. And
See, I think a lot of these kind of things you're talking about, the situation of Job and other people in the Old Testament, are really, in a sense, a foil for the life of Jesus and what Jesus brings to us in a way that none of them could fully understand from their point of view in life. Take the imprecatory Psalms, which curses your enemies. I mean, we're talking some pretty serious curses. May you break the teeth of the wicked. May it be so bad you've smashed their teeth, they can't eat anymore and they've starved to death. This is a bad thing. This is a prayer. We don't really know what to do with these kind of prayers. These are not the sort of prayers that usually make it into the lectionary to be read on Sunday morning. Blessed is the man who takes your babies and busts their brains out on a rock. What do you do with that on Sunday morning? That's a hard verse. But I think they serve as foils from the human standpoint that bring us to Christ. And I think that's exactly what Paul has in mind when he says that this was our schoolmaster, this was our slave custodian, to bring us to Christ so that we would understand in a way that we could not understand outside of his life. Yeah.
As much as he's defending himself, I think that his friends look at it that he's prideful.
Yes.
Because he's saying, this is what I have on my resume almost. Like, this is what I've done.
Yeah.
Let me and the suffering is causing him to re-examine and recount
Yeah.
his actions. And he's like, what, is this what I have? Like, he's questioning so much that it's like he's being shaken, but yet faith remains as he's being
Yeah.
shaken. And it can either look both ways. Like, oh yay, he's defending himself, or he's just full of himself because he's just talking about himself.
And they don't seem to realize that they're pretty full of themselves. They're truly taking the speck out of Job's eye and missing these beams in the road. Yeah, I think that's true. Well, the resolution in the book of Job comes when God answers Job out of the whirlwind. This is a drawing by William Blake, who was an English poet and artist back in the 19th century. Blake was kind of an unusual poet. I'm not sure I would recommend him straight across the board, but on the other hand, he has some pretty fascinating things, and some of his drawings are fascinating. This is one of them, Job hearing the voice of God out of the whirlwind. But in any case, at no point did God ultimately explain Job's suffering. You get to the end of the book, and I think probably most of you wish there was a little bit more said than was said. God does not explain why Job suffered. Instead, he leaves Job with two conclusions. And I think these two conclusions are very important. First of all, the problem of evil is bigger than Job's capacity to understand as a mere human being. This is why in the end, Job will say, I will put my hand over my mouth and I'll quit talking. Because I ask questions about things that were too wonderful for me to know. That's an interesting turn of phrase, isn't it? Things too wonderful for me to know. You find it crops up in the Psalms also, this expression, things too wonderful for me to know. So it's a way of saying that the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, if you want to call it that, is bigger than Job's human capacity to understand. The second conclusion from the book is that the idea of suffering is not simply cause and effect. That was what was offered by Job's friends, and God says, your friends are wrong. You have not spoken what is right concerning me or my servant Job. So the book of Job does not fully answer the problem of evil, but it does warn us against superficial solutions. And most of the conversation by Job's friends are superficial solutions, especially the notion that suffering is just cause and effect. Now, going back to what David was talking about a moment or two ago, Jesus and his relationship with Job, I think it's really interesting to notice the answers that Jesus gave to the questions of Job. Job has a lot of questions, and I think Jesus gives answers to those questions. Universal questions. Does God understand human suffering? in Jesus Christ, he does experientially. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, it says, the Lord was made like us in every way. He suffered as we suffer. So God understands human suffering. He is not a high priest who is untouched by our difficulties, but in every way he was made like us so that he can be an empathetic high priest. This is what the scripture says. Can humans be righteous before God? Yes, they can, but not in themselves. They can be righteous before God when they stand in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And in that way, they can come near to God. And that again is what the New Testament says. We who once were far off are brought near through the blood of Christ. We have come close to God. And we can be declared righteous before God because we are in Christ, not in ourselves. If we are found simply in ourselves, we will always fall short. But we are found in Him. To be found in Him, Paul says, having a righteousness that does not come from legalistic observance, but the righteousness that comes by God through faith. That is the righteousness by which we can stand before God. Is there a human mediator who can fully relate to both God and human life? Someone who can put his arm around God and put his arm around us and bring us together? Absolutely. And that one is the mediator, the one mediator, Jesus Christ, who is both God and human. Will God cover human sin so that He might have a relationship with His creatures? Job asked this question. Absolutely yes. God covers sin. And that covering, that atonement brings us together so that we can have fellowship with God. And will there be justice in the end? Absolutely there will. There will be justice in the end. As Job said in one of his famous sayings, I know that my Redeemer lives. He will stand at the latter day upon the earth, and if the skin worms destroy my body, yet in my flesh I will see God. I will see Him and not another. Oh, how my heart yearns within me, Job says. What a powerful, powerful statement. I remember 3 or 4 years ago, I was attending a funeral of one of my parishioners. His father had passed away and was... the funeral was in one of the Lutheran churches in Michigan. And it was an old-style Lutheran church with a balcony and the choir in the balcony, okay, rather than somewhere else, you know. And I know today, probably you guys don't have choirs at all. You just have praise bands. But this was more traditional, so it had a choir and all that stuff. But as we came into the funeral, the choir began to sing, I know that my Redeemer lives. I thought, that's right. That's exactly right. That's what we ought to sing when a believer dies. I know that my Redeemer lives, and He will stand at the last day upon the earth. And though worms destroy my body, yet I will see God. I will see Him. And I think that faith in Job, that we see in Job, is a very powerful testimony in spite of some unanswered questions. I think our natural tendency is to think that we have to have all of our questions answered before we can be satisfied. And I think the book of Job says that's not so. We can be satisfied even without all of our questions answered. And Job was satisfied in that way. Okay, this is a good time for your 15-minute break. And so let's take it. No, sorry, there's an announcement.